The autumn rain fell steadily over the coastal village of Porto Vedera as three armed men stalked through the narrow streets toward the lone cottage on the hill. Their boots splashed through puddles with cruel purpose, weapons concealed beneath. Wet coats. They couldn't have known that the pregnant widow arranging flowers in her window, her delicate hands moving with practiced grace, was once known as La Sombra, the most lethal intelligence operative in the Mediterranean resistance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The seaside village of Porto Vedera had always been a place where secrets washed away with the tide. Its steep, winding streets and weathered stone buildings had witnessed centuries of whispered conspiracies and quiet disappearances. But on this rain-soaked autumn morning, as Elena Rossi carefully arranged white lilies in her window, the village was about to witness something unprecedented. Through the rain-streaked glass, Elena's keen eyes tracked the movement of the three men making their way up the cobblestone street toward her cottage. Her right hand, which had once decoded messages that toppled governments, maintained its gentle caress of the flower petals. Her left hand, which had wielded everything from lockpicks to garrots in service of the resistance, rested protectively over her swollen belly. 6 months pregnant, she appeared every bit the vulnerable widow that her carefully crafted cover suggested. Inside the cottage, young Sofia Martinez watched the approaching men with growing concern. The 14-year-old girl had been coming to help Elena with household tasks ever since the supposed death of Elena's husband Marco 7 months ago. But Sofia knew things about her employer that no one else in Porto Vedera suspected. She had seen the hidden compartments throughout the cottage, watched Elena maintain her physical training in secret, and caught glimpses of coded messages that sometimes arrived concealed within ordinary deliveries. The men's approach was deliberate, professional. Elena recognized their movement patterns immediately. Former military, probably special forces turned mercenary. Their casual clothes couldn't hide the way they constantly scanned their surroundings or how they maintained precise spacing between each other. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scar along his jaw, moved with the contained violence of a predator. Under different circumstances, Elena might have admired their technique. "Sofia!" Elena called softly, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she always used with the girl. "Remember what we practiced. It's time for you to check on the bread in the cellar." It was a phrase they had rehearsed dozens of times, its true meaning clear to them both. Sofia immediately moved toward the concealed door that led to the cottage's extensive basement complex, her movements as quiet as Elena had taught her. The rain intensified, drums beating against the terracotta roof tiles. Elena continued her work with the flowers, but her mind was already racing through contingencies. The cottage, which appeared to be a modest widow's residence, had been carefully designed and modified over the past 2 years. Every window provided clear lines of sight, every piece of furniture could serve as cover, and every decorative feature concealed some tactical advantage. Even her current position at the window had been carefully chosen. The angle of approach forced visitors to expose themselves while keeping her in shadows. Through the rain, she could now make out more details about her unwanted visitors. The leader's scar was relatively fresh, probably from within the last year. The second man favored his left leg slightly, an old injury that would slow him. In close quarters, the third, younger and less experienced, kept adjusting the weapon poorly concealed under his jacket. They moved like a team that had worked together before, but their formation suggested they weren't expecting serious resistance. Another crack of thunder rolled across the bay as Elena thought about the network of people in Porto Vedera who would respond to her signals. Old Giuseppe, who ran the bakery, had been resistance before her. his shop's brick ovens, hiding more than just bread during the occupation. Maria at the flower market could activate a warning system that would spread through the village in minutes. Even Father Santiago, who heard confessions at the ancient stone church, had ways of passing messages that would never be suspected. Elena felt her baby kick, as if sensing her heightened alertness. She allowed herself a small, genuine smile. This child would be born into a world of peace if she had anything to say about it. But first, she would have to deal with these men who thought they had found easy prey in a pregnant widow. They couldn't know that La Sombra had planned for this moment ever since she'd chosen this village as her refuge, that every aspect of her quiet life had been carefully constructed to conceal lethal capability. The men were closer now, their features clearer through the rain. Elena's trained eye caught the subtle bulge of body armor beneath their jackets, the outline of combat knives in boot sheaths, the telltale shape of silenced pistols under their arms. They were well-equipped, professional, dangerous, and completely unaware that they were walking into a trap years in the making. The leader of the group paused at Elena's garden gate, his scarred face breaking into what might have been intended as a charming smile. His eyes, however, remained cold and calculating as they swept across the cottage's facade. Elena recognized that particular mix of ruthless intelligence and casual cruelty. She had seen it countless times during her years in the resistance, in the faces of men who believed power gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. "Signora Rossi," he called out, his Italian carrying a slight Eastern European accent. "My associates and I hoped we might have a moment of your time." His hand rested casually on the gate latch, but Elena noticed how his fingers remained loose, ready to move to the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. Elena turned from her flowers with carefully choreographed slowness, allowing a trace of anxiety to show in her expression. Every movement was precisely calculated, the slight tremor in her hands, the protective way she cradled her pregnant belly, the hesitation in her voice as she responded. "I'm afraid I'm not receiving visitors today, signori. Perhaps you could return when my brother-in-law is here." The scarred man's smile widened, but his eyes grew colder. "Your brother-in-law, Francesco Rossi? I'm afraid he won't be joining us today, or any day for that matter." He pushed the gate open, the hinges creaking in the rain. "You see, we had a rather unfortunate conversation with him in Milan last night." Elena allowed her face to pale slightly, her hands tightening on the flower vase, but her mind was already cataloguing details. The mud on their boots was local, meaning they'd been in Porto Vedera for at least a few hours. The younger one's jacket was slightly bulkier on the left side, indicating a shoulder holster designed for a larger weapon than the others carried. The way the second man positioned himself suggested he was expecting trouble from the narrow alley beside the cottage. In the basement, Sophia had already activated the first of Elena's warning systems, a series of small mirrors, carefully positioned. Throughout the village would now be reflecting signals to key locations. Giuseppe would be closing his bakery early, Maria would be making her usual deliveries with extra messages, and Father Santiago would ensure certain people stayed away from what was about to become a very dangerous area. "What do you want?" Elena asked, allowing a quaver to enter her voice. She took a small step back from the window, seemingly in fear. In reality, the movement gave her access to the first of many hidden weapons she had positioned throughout the cottage. Her fingers brushed against the thin wire garrote concealed in the window frame, even as her other hand remained visible, trembling slightly on her belly. The scarred man stepped onto her porch, rainwater dripping from his coat. "Information, signora. Just some simple information about your late husband's activities during the revolution, and perhaps about a certain operative known as La Sombra." His smile turned predatory. "You see, we have reason to believe Marco Rossi knew quite a bit about both subjects before his unfortunate accident." Eleanor's breath caught, a perfectly practiced display of grief and fear. Marco was a merchant, nothing more. He died in a shipping accident. I don't know anything about politics or revolution. Even as she spoke, her trained senses were mapping the men's positions, calculating angles, noting how the rain would affect visibility and footing. The second man had moved to cover the side of the cottage, but he hadn't noticed how the climbing roses on the wall concealed thin tripwires, or how the seemingly decorative garden tools could become lethal weapons in trained hands. The younger one remained by the gate, trying to appear casual while maintaining a watch on the street. None of them had noticed the slight discoloration in the porch boards, where Eleanor had reinforced certain sections while weakening others. A merchant, the scarred man chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. Is that why he had coded transmissions hidden in his shipping manifests? Why he made so many trips to ports that just happened to be resistant strongholds? He took another step forward, close enough now that Elena could smell expensive cologne beneath the rain. Come now, Signora, a beautiful woman like you. Surely Marco shared his secrets, pillow talk perhaps? Elena allowed tears to well up in her eyes, even as her muscles tensed in preparation. Please, I'm pregnant. I don't know anything. Just leave us in peace. The us was deliberate. She needed to remind them of her condition, make them underestimate her further. In her experience, men like these often became careless when dealing with pregnant women, viewing them as doubly vulnerable. The scarred man's face hardened. I'm afraid peace isn't an option, Signora Rossi. But how unpleasant this becomes depends entirely on your cooperation. He gestured to his companions. Search the house, thoroughly. His eyes never left Elena as he added, carefully though. Our employer wants her unharmed. For now. As the men moved to comply, Elena allowed herself to tremble more visibly, but beneath her facade of fear, her mind was already moving through combat scenarios, timing sequences, calculating how to use her pregnancy as both shield and weapon. These men had come expecting to intimidate a grieving widow. They were about to learn why La Sombra had never been caught, despite a decade of operations that had helped bring down the old regime. Through the rain, she caught a flash of light from the church tower, Father Santiago's signal that her message had been received. In the cellar, Sophia would be preparing the next phase of their defenses. And somewhere in the village, Eleanor's network of allies would be moving into position, ready to ensure that no evidence of what was about to happen would ever reach the authorities. The young man stepped past her into the cottage, his boots leaving wet prints on her clean floor. Elena noted how his hand stayed close to his concealed weapon, how his eyes darted around the room looking for threats. Good instincts, she thought, just not good enough. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The year was 2008, and the old regime's grip on power was beginning to crack. Elena sat in the University of Milan's Grand Library, surrounded by ancient texts and modern political treatises, unaware that her life was about to change forever. At 22, she had already mastered 6 languages, with a particular gift for detecting nuances and patterns that others missed. This talent had caught the attention of Professor Alessandro Romano, though Elena didn't yet know the elderly linguistics expert was far more than he appeared. Language, my dear, Romano had told her one rainy evening, his weathered hands gesturing at the books surrounding them, is not just about communication, it's about power. Those who control language control truth itself. Only later would Elena understand he was testing her, watching how she processed ideas about information and control. The regime's latest crackdown had begun that spring. Students disappeared from classrooms. Professors were arrested for seditious teachings. and the secret police maintained a constant presence on campus. Elena's family had already felt the regime's brutality. Her father, a newspaper editor, had been imprisoned for publishing unauthorized stories about government corruption. Her mother's bookshop had been closed for selling unapproved literature. Professor Romano found her late one night in the library's restricted section, where she'd broken in to access banned historical documents. Instead of reporting her, he smiled and said words that would change her life. "How would you like to learn languages that don't exist in any book?" That night, Elena learned about the Network, a secret organization that had operated within the resistance for decades. They were information specialists, master linguists who had developed their own evolving codes and communication systems. Their operatives could have entire conversations in public using nothing but subtle gestures, could encode vital intelligence in seemingly innocent newspaper advertisements, could coordinate complex operations through patterns in everyday activities. "The regime controls the phones, the internet, the mail," Romano explained. "But they cannot control the way a flower seller arranges her blooms, or how a street musician times his songs, or which windows have their shutters open at certain hours." His eyes had gleamed with pride as he added, "We have built an invisible language out of life itself." Elena's training began immediately. Her linguistic skills provided the foundation, but the network demanded far more. She learned to read body language like a native tongue, to detect emotional undercurrents in a room as easily as she could spot grammatical errors in a text. She studied the psychology of deception, the mathematics of codes, the anthropology of human behavior patterns. The physical training was equally intense. "Your body must speak as fluently as your mind," instructed Madame Rosetta, a former ballet dancer who taught network operatives to move with deliberate grace. Elena learned to hide lethal capability beneath elegant gestures, to disguise combat, moves as casual movements, to transform everyday objects into weapons without ever revealing their deadly purpose. But it was her gift for improvisation that truly set her apart. During a training exercise in her second year, Elena created an entirely new code system using nothing but the way she hung laundry on a line. When regime surveillance interrupted a crucial operation, she coordinated the entire team's escape through subtle variations in how she stirred her coffee at a cafe. Her ability to transform ordinary patterns of life into sophisticated communication tools earned her the code name that would become legend, La Sombra, the shadow. "You understand the deeper truth," Romano told her after that operation. True. Invisibility isn't about not being seen. It's about being seen as exactly what people expect to see. This philosophy would become the cornerstone of Elena's methodology. She learned to disappear not by hiding, but by presenting such a perfect picture of innocence that observers simply filtered her out of their threat assessments. By 2012, Elena had become the network's most effective operative. She could walk into heavily guarded regime facilities simply by matching her movement patterns so perfectly to the environment that security personnel's brains simply categorized her as belonging. She could extract information from the most paranoid targets by reflecting their expectations so precisely that they never realized they were being manipulated. But her greatest talent was building long-term covers. Elena could weave herself into a community so naturally that within months people would swear they remembered her from childhood. She constructed identities that weren't just disguises, but fully realized lives, each detail supporting a coherent whole that could withstand the deepest scrutiny. If you're fascinated by languages and codes, leave a comment telling us how many languages you speak, and don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story about a former cryptographer who outfoxed international art thieves will keep you on the edge of your seat. The real transformation, however, came during the Milan crisis of 2013. The regime had launched its most brutal crackdown yet, using new surveillance technology to track resistance communications. Traditional codes had been broken, safe houses compromised, operatives captured. In response, Elena created something unprecedented, a living code that evolved organically through everyday social interactions, impossible to break because it never remained static. The scarred man's boots left wet marks on Elena's pristine floor as he circled her living room, his practiced eye scanning for anything suspicious. But Elena knew he wouldn't find what he was looking for. Her training had taught her that the best hiding places were the ones that didn't look like hiding places at all. The coded messages were hidden in plain sight, in the pattern of stitches in her embroidery, in the arrangement of recipe cards in her kitchen, in the seemingly random organization of books on her shelves. "Your husband kept very interesting. Accompany Signora Rossi," he said, picking up a framed photograph of Elena and Marco on their wedding day. "For instance, the priest who performed this ceremony, Father Dominic, wasn't it? Interesting that he disappeared right after certain regime documents surfaced." His thumb traced the edge of the frame, not noticing how the angle of the photograph on the wall behind it was actually a marker in Elena's complex household code system. Elena allowed her hand to shake as she set down her flower vase. Father Dominic had health problems. He retired to a monastery in the mountains. The tremor in her voice was calculated, just enough to suggest fear without crossing into obvious deception. Meanwhile, her peripheral vision tracked the other two men as they moved through her house, noting how the younger one's footsteps would bring him directly over the reinforced cellar where Sophia waited. The man with the limp was methodically checking the kitchen, his movements suggesting military intelligence training. He opened cupboards with practiced efficiency, ran his hands along the undersides of drawers, tapped walls listening for hollow spaces. Elena watched him through the reflection in a copper pot, noting how he favored his left leg, an old injury that would compromise his balance if things turned violent. "A monastery in the mountains," the scarred man repeated, his tone making it clear he didn't believe her. "Like how your husband died in a shipping accident. Like how your brother-in-law had an unfortunate conversation in Milan." He set the photograph down with deliberate care. "You see, Signora, we've been investigating these convenient accidents and disappearances. They form a very interesting pattern." Thunder rolled across the bay as Elena shifted her position slightly, using her pregnancy as an excuse to rest against the wall. The movement placed her within reach of 3 different concealed weapons while appearing completely natural. "I don't know anything about patterns," she said, letting her voice crack slightly. "I'm just trying to survive until my baby comes." The young man's voice carried from the hallway, where he was examining the antique chest that Elena used to store blankets. "Matteo, something's not right here. The dimensions don't match." He was smart. He'd noticed that the chest's exterior measurements didn't align with its interior space, but he was looking for hidden compartments in the wrong place, not realizing the chest itself was a deliberate distraction from other, more subtle hiding spots. "Careful with that," the scarred man, Matteo, called to his companion. "Our employer wants any documents intact." He turned back to Elena, his expression hardening. "You see, Signora, we know Marco Rossi was connected to La Sombra. We know he helped coordinate resistance operations through his shipping business. What we don't know." He stepped closer, invading her space with deliberate intimidation, "is where certain sensitive materials ended up after his death." Elena let tears well up in her eyes. Years of training allowing her to project exactly the right mix of fear, grief, and confusion. Marco was a good man. He didn't deserve what happened to him. This, at least, was completely true, though not in the way they would interpret it. Her husband had indeed been a good man, one who had understood exactly who and what she was, who had helped her maintain her cover while supporting her mission. The man in the kitchen had moved to the pantry, methodically checking the preserved foods that Elena had carefully prepared. She knew the moment he would reach the shelf of homemade tomato sauce, knew exactly how many seconds it would take him to notice that some of the jars had slightly different seals. Through the window's reflection, she caught a glimpse of movement. In the rain, Maria's flower cart moving down the street, its colorful blooms arranged in a pattern that signaled readiness. "Nobody deserves what happened to Marco," Matteo agreed, his voice carrying false sympathy. "Just like nobody deserves what happened to your brother-in-law last night. But you, Signora." His hand moved to grip her arm, not quite hard enough. "To leave bruises, but with clear, threatening intent. You have the power to prevent any more unfortunate accidents." Elena allowed herself to flinch at his touch, even as her muscles coiled in preparation. Years of training had taught her that the key to survival wasn't just about fighting skill. It was about choosing the perfect moment to reveal that skill. Through the window, she could see Father Santiago's church, where the bell would soon toll 3 times, signaling that her network was in position. The young man had moved beyond the chest, now examining the hallway's decorative mirrors. Elena had positioned those mirrors precisely, creating a complex system of sight lines throughout the house. Right now, they showed her that Sophia had successfully accessed the hidden compartment beneath the cellar stairs, where emergency supplies and communications equipment were stored. "We can do this the easy way," Matteo continued, his grip tightening slightly. "Just tell us where Marco hid La Sombra's documents. Tell us about the network's new communication protocols. Save us all a lot of unpleasantness." His other hand moved to rest significantly on Elena's pregnant belly, a gesture that crossed the line from threatening to unforgivable. The church bell began to toll, its sound carrying clearly through the rain. 1, 2, 3. Elena felt the familiar calm settle over her, the absolute clarity that preceded action. These men had come expecting to intimidate a grieving widow. Instead, they had walked into the lair of La Sombra herself, and they were about to learn why that name had haunted the regime's nightmares for over a decade. The cottage that Elena had chosen as her refuge 2 years ago appeared modest and unremarkable from the outside. Its weathered stone walls and red-tiled roof blended perfectly with the other homes dotting Porto Vedera's hillside. But like everything in Elena's world, appearances were carefully calculated to conceal deeper truths. Every architectural feature, every piece of furniture, every decorative element served multiple purposes in her intricately layered defense system. Matteo's hand remained on her belly, a tactical error that would cost him dearly. His position blocked his partner's line of sight from the kitchen, while the young man in the hallway had become distracted by the false compartment in the chest. Elena allowed herself to sway slightly, as if dizzy from fear, using the movement to assess the distance to her first prepared response point. The cottage's true genius lay in its subtle modifications. The antique wooden floorboards, which appeared to creak randomly under pressure, actually created a precise map of movement through the house. Elena could track exactly where each man was without seeing them, simply by interpreting the pattern of creaks and groans. She had spent months carefully adjusting each board, testing different sounds under various weights, creating an acoustic surveillance system disguised as old house noises. In the kitchen, the limping man had reached the crucial shelf of preserved tomatoes. Elena counted silently as she heard him slide jars aside, knowing the exact moment he would notice the subtle differences in their seals. Some contained actual, preserved tomatoes. Others contained documents soaked in tomato-colored resin, a network technique for hiding paper records in plain sight. But all of them had been prepared with another purpose in mind. "Signora," Matteo's voice carried the false patience of a predator toying with prey, "you're only making this harder on yourself. We know Marco was coordinating with La Sombra. We know about the resistance supply routes hidden in his shipping manifestos. Just tell us where he stored the real records." Elena let her knees buckle slightly, forcing Matteo to adjust his grip. The movement brought her closer to the window, where the flower vase she had been arranging sat in a precise position. The water in the vase, like every liquid in the house, had been infused with a chemical compound developed by network chemists. Harmless until activated, but capable of producing intense effects when combined with the right catalyst. Through the copper pot's reflection, she saw the man in the kitchen remove one of the jar's seals, exactly as she had anticipated. The moisture from the rain had already begun activating the compound embedded in the seal's adhesive. Within minutes, he would begin experiencing subtle disorientation, nothing obvious enough to raise immediate alarm, but sufficient to degrade his combat effectiveness. The young man in the hallway had moved past the chest, now examining the series of mirrors. Elena had mounted along the walls. "These are positioned strangely," he called out, showing dangerous perceptiveness. The mirrors did indeed form an elaborate system of sight lines throughout the house, but they also served another purpose. Their frames contained a sophisticated alarm system, while their surfaces had been treated with a special coating that could temporarily produce dazzling reflections when hit by specific light wavelengths. Sophia, hidden safely in the cellar, would be monitoring the situation through cleverly concealed observation ports. The girl had been trained to recognize specific signals and implement corresponding responses. Elena had designed the entire system to be operated by a single person in an emergency, though Sophia's presence provided additional tactical options. "Your husband's shipping company," Matteo continued, his grip remaining inappropriately on her belly, "made some interesting deliveries in its final months. Medical supplies that weren't really medical supplies. Construction materials that contained something else entirely. All coordinated through a system of codes that we've only partly cracked." Elena allowed a slight tremor to run through her body, making it seem like fear was overwhelming her. The movement let her shift her weight again, positioning herself perfectly for what would come next. Through the window, she caught another signal from Maria's flower cart. The resistance network was fully in position around the cottage, though the men inside would never spot them. Members of the network excelled at blending into everyday life, becoming part of the background that everyone saw, but no one noticed. The rain continued its steady drumming on the roof, masking the subtle sounds of Sophia accessing the cellar's secondary systems. Elena had designed the cottage's acoustics to use the rain to her advantage, creating audio dead zones that would prevent her attackers from coordinating effectively once action began. The same rain that reduced visibility outside would help conceal her network's movements while amplifying the disorienting effects she had prepared inside. "Time is running out, Signora." Matteo's voice hardened as his patience began to wear thin. He didn't realize that time had been running according to Elena's schedule from the moment they entered her gate. The compounds were activating, the positions were set, and her enemies had unknowingly arranged themselves exactly where she needed them. The church bells had finished their signal, and Elena caught the briefest glimpse of Father Santiago himself in his bell tower. The old priest had been resistance long before Elena, and his position provided the perfect vantage point to coordinate the external elements of her defense network. He would ensure that no evidence of what was about to happen would ever reach official channels. Thunder rolled across the bay once more as Elena prepared herself for the moment of transition when the carefully maintained facade of the vulnerable widow would give way to the lethal precision of La Sombra. These men had come to her home seeking information about a legendary operative, never suspecting that they were already caught in her web. They were about to learn why the network's most effective agent had never been caught, despite orchestrating some of the Resistance's most crucial operations. Before we continue with the unfolding tension in Porto Vedera, we must return to another rain-soaked evening 5 years earlier, when Elena first met Marco Rossi. If you're watching from a place where love and duty have intersected in your life, share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for tomorrow's tale about a former ballerina who sacrificed everything for justice. The network had sent Elena to investigate suspicious shipping patterns along the coast. Marco's company had caught their attention, not because of obvious resistance ties, but because of its perfect ordinariness. Every manifest was flawless, every route logical, every transaction precisely documented. To Elena's trained eye, this, perfection itself, was the anomaly. She arranged to meet him at a cafe in Genoa, playing the role of a minor customs official concerned about paperwork discrepancies. Elena had expected to find either a skilled resistance operative or a regime collaborator. Instead, she found something far more intriguing. A man who had created his own independent intelligence network under the guise of normal business operations. The interesting thing about shipping manifests, Marco had told her that first evening, his eyes twinkling with subtle intelligence, is that they tell stories beyond their obvious content. Patterns of trade, movements of goods, timing of deliveries. It's all a language if you know how to read it. He sipped his espresso with deliberate casualness, but Elena recognized the precise way he scanned their surroundings. This was a man who understood surveillance. Their courtship began as a careful dance of intelligence and counterintelligence. Elena maintained her cover as she investigated his operation, while Marco pretended not to notice how she tested his security. They discussed literature that contained coded resistance messages, debated philosophy that masked strategic planning, and shared seemingly innocent stories that revealed their true capabilities. "You're different," he told her one night as they walked along the moonlit harbor. "Most operatives I've met try to become someone else entirely, but you—" He studied her with genuine admiration. "You become more authentically yourself in each role you play." It was the first acknowledgement between them that they both knew exactly who and what the other was. Professor Romano had warned Elena about emotional attachments. "In our work," he'd said, "love is both a strength and a vulnerability. The key is to understand which it becomes in each situation." But with Marco, Elena found something unprecedented. A partner who understood that her dedication to the cause didn't diminish her capacity for genuine feeling, but enhanced it. Their wedding was a masterpiece of tactical planning disguised as romantic tradition. Every guest was carefully chosen, their seating arrangement creating subtle communication networks across the reception. The flower arrangements contained coded messages. The music selections signaled specific operatives, and even their vows contained layers of meaning understood only by certain attendees. "Most people," Marco observed during their honeymoon in Sicily, "think deception is about hiding the truth, but you've shown me it's really about revealing the right kind of truth at the right moment." He had helped her understand that her greatest strength wasn't in her ability to deceive, but in her talent for weaving truth and fiction together so seamlessly that even she sometimes forgot where one ended and the other began. Together, they developed new methods of resistance operations. Marco's shipping company provided perfect cover for moving supplies and information, while Elena's network of social connections allowed them to coordinate complex operations through seemingly innocent interactions. They created a system where every legitimate business transaction could carry hidden meaning, where everyday social events could mask revolutionary planning. But their success drew unwanted attention. The regime's intelligence services began to notice patterns they couldn't quite decode. Pressure mounted as investigations intensified. Elena and Marco knew they would eventually face a choice between their work and their life together. "The thing about shadows," Marco told her during their last private conversation, "is that they're most effective when they protect something worth illuminating." His hand had rested on her belly, then just beginning to show the first signs of their child. "Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in fighting the darkness, but in preserving the light." The decision to fake Marco's death had been mutual. His accident was orchestrated with the same precision as their wedding, every detail carefully planned to withstand scrutiny. Elena's performance as the grieving widow drew on genuine emotion, making it utterly convincing. Marco disappeared into a new identity, coordinating a different part of the resistance while Elena maintained their original network. Only Sophia, watching Elena prepare for Marco's funeral, had noticed that her grief contained layers of purpose. The girl had already begun her training then, learning to recognize how genuine emotion could be shaped into tactical advantage. Elena had taught her that true strength often lay not in suppressing feelings, but in transforming them into tools of survival. Now, as Elena stood in her cottage facing Matteo's threats, she drew on everything Marco had helped her understand about using truth as a weapon. Her fear for her unborn child was real, which made her performance as a frightened widow utterly convincing. Her grief over being separated from Marco was genuine, which made her reactions to their questions about his death completely believable. The rain falling on Porto Vedera carried echoes of that first meeting in Genoa, of all the choices and sacrifices that had led to this moment. Elena had learned from Marco that the most effective deception wasn't in pretending to be something you're not, but in carefully choosing which parts of yourself to reveal. As she prepared to show these men exactly why La Sombra had become legend, she silently thanked Marco for helping her understand that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the truth itself, revealed at precisely the right moment. The transformation began with a single drop of water falling from Elena's flower vase. In the split second, before Matteo could react to the subtle movement of her hand, that drop struck the specially treated floorboard beneath their feet. The chemical reaction was immediate and precise, a soft hiss followed by a barely visible mist rising from the point of impact. Matteo's enhanced interrogation training had taught him to recognize many threats, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for the sophisticated compounds Elena had developed with network chemists. The mist's effect was subtle at first, a slight disorientation, a momentary confusion about which way was up. By the time he realized something was wrong, Elena had already begun her counterattack. "What? What did you—" His grip on her arm loosened fractionally as the compound took effect. That microscopic relaxation was all Elena needed. Years of training under Madame Rosetta had taught her that true combat effectiveness wasn't about strength, but about turning an opponent's expectations against them. Elena moved with the liquid grace that had earned her the name La Sombra, using her pregnancy not as a hindrance, but as a point of balance. Her elbow found the precise nerve cluster in Matteo's forearm, causing his hand to spasm open. As he instinctively reached for his concealed weapon, she was already flowing past him, her movements so smooth they barely registered as threatening until it was too late. In the kitchen, the man with the limp had begun to experience the effects of the treated jar seals. His attempt to call out a warning emerged as a confused mumble. The young man in the hallway, showing better instincts than his companions, reached for his radio. But Sophia, monitoring through the cellar's observation ports, had already activated the cottage's electromagnetic disruption system, another of Elena's carefully prepared defenses. "Communications are being jammed," the young man called out, his voice carrying an edge of increasing panic. "Something's interfering with—" His words cut off as Elena triggered her next layer of preparation. The mirrors lining the hallway, treated with photoreactive compounds, caught the sudden flash from Sophia's signal lamp. The resulting cascade of reflected light, precisely calculated for disorienting effect, left him blinking and stumbling. Matteo tried to regain control of the situation, but the mist had affected his depth perception. His grab for Elena missed by millimeters, his usually precise movements now uncoordinated. "She's not what she seems," he managed to warn his companions, finally recognizing the deadly grace in her movements. "She's trained. She's—" "Oh, I'm exactly what I seem," Elena replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had made La Sombra legendary in resistance circles. "I'm a pregnant widow defending her home. I'm just better at it than you expected." The statement was perfectly true. Another lesson from Marco about using truth as a weapon. Through the window, Elena caught Maria's signal. The external security network was fully activated. Father Santiago's church bells began a new pattern, this one warning the townspeople to stay clear of the area. The rain continued its steady drumming, masking the subtle sounds of movement as Elena's allies moved into their final positions around the cottage. The man in the kitchen had discovered another of Elena's preparations. His attempt to reach his backup weapon found the shoulder holster subtly stiffened, the leather treated with a compound that had hardened in response to his perspiration. Each movement to free his gun only made the holster more rigid, effectively trapping the weapon. Elena's counterattack continued with the same methodical precision that marked all her operations. Each movement was choreographed to appear reactive when it was actually precisely planned. She stumbled, apparently trying to escape Matteo's reach, but the movement positioned her perfectly to access the next set of prepared defenses. "The network is finished," Matteo snarled, fighting through the compound's effects to make another grab for her. "Your precious resistance is being rounded up even now. This whole village will be—" His threat dissolved into confusion as Elena activated another of her preparations. The seemingly decorative wind chimes by the window began resonating at a specific frequency, another network innovation designed to enhance the disorienting effects of their chemical compounds. The young man in the hallway showed remarkable resilience, shaking off the effects of the flash more quickly than Elena had anticipated. He managed to draw his weapon, but Sophia had been waiting for precisely this moment. The girl activated the next phase of Elena's defense system, a series of precisely calibrated sounds played through hidden speakers. Each tone was engineered to interfere with inner ear balance, making accurate aim virtually impossible. "You don't understand what you've walked into," Elena told them, her voice carrying clearly despite the chaos she had orchestrated. "This isn't just a cottage. It's not just a widow's refuge. It's a demonstration of everything La Sombra spent years perfecting." Each word was punctuated by another element of her defense system activating, subtle effects that built upon each other in carefully planned sequence. The man in the kitchen made a desperate lunge toward her, but his compromised balance betrayed him. Elena redirected his momentum with the same graceful efficiency that had made her the network's most effective close combat instructor. His own forward motion sent him stumbling into Matteo, disrupting their leader's attempt to regain control of the situation. Thunder rolled across Porto Vedera as Elena's carefully orchestrated defense reached its crescendo. Every element she had prepared, every compound she had placed, every system she had installed, worked together in lethal harmony. The cottage that had appeared so vulnerable was revealing its true nature, a sophisticated trap designed by the Resistance's most legendary operative. Through the chaos of disoriented men and activated defenses, a slow clapping sound carried from the cottage doorway. The measured applause cut through the confusion like a knife, bringing the frantic scene to an abrupt halt. Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized the distinctive rhythm. 3 claps, pause, 2 claps, a pattern she hadn't heard in 5 years. "Magnificently executed, my dear," came a familiar voice, its cultured tone carrying notes of genuine admiration. The chemical compounds in the vase water, the treated mirror surfaces, the acoustic disruption system, all vintage network techniques, but implemented with your characteristic elegance. Professor Alessandro Romano stepped into the cottage, his silver hair immaculate despite the rain, his expensive suit as perfectly pressed as it had been in the university libraries where he had first recruited her. Elena maintained her defensive position, her mind racing through implications. Romano's presence changed everything. Her former mentor knew all her methods, had helped develop many of the techniques she was using. More importantly, he knew how she thought, how she planned, how she adapted. "Professor," she acknowledged, keeping her voice steady, "I thought you were still teaching in Milan." Romano smiled, the expression carrying the same warmth it had when he praised her linguistic innovations years ago. "Oh, I've been teaching many things to many people, Elena, including your friend Matteo here, about certain patterns in resistance operations." He gestured to the scarred man, who was fighting through the effects of Elena's compounds with new purpose. "Though I must say he proved a less apt pupil than you were." The revelation struck Elena like a physical blow. Romano had been the one tracking her operations, using his intimate knowledge of network methods to decode her carefully hidden patterns. He had trained Matteo's team, prepared them specifically to counter her techniques. But why? The professor had been resistance before she was born, had helped build the network from its foundations. "Times change, my dear," Romano continued, reading her thoughts with the same insight that had made him such an effective mentor. "The old regime fell, but what replaced it? Chaos, disorder, a vacuum that needs to be filled with proper guidance." His shoes left precise marks on her floor as he entered, each step carefully placed to avoid her prepared trigger points. The network's techniques are methods of control and influence. They shouldn't be wasted on abstract ideals of freedom. They should serve order, structure, purpose. Through her peripheral vision, Elena saw Sophia maintaining her position, in the cellar, waiting for signals. The girl would be wondering why Elena hadn't triggered the next phase of defenses. But Romano would be expecting those responses, would have prepared countermeasures for each of her standard protocols. "Your work with Marco was brilliant," Romano praised, moving further into the room with calculated precision. "Using shipping routes to encode resistance operations, hiding supply lines in legitimate business transactions, truly innovative applications of our principles, but ultimately misguided." His eyes settled on her pregnant belly with disturbing intensity. "Though I see you've been productive in other ways as well." Elena felt Matteo and his men regaining their coordination as Romano produced a small device from his pocket, an electronic countermeasure, she realized, designed to neutralize her compound's effects. Of course, he would have developed defenses against network techniques. He had helped create many of them. "The network is being dismantled as we speak," Romano informed her, his tone carrying genuine regret. "All those carefully built systems of communication and control, all that beautiful infrastructure of influence, it's being repurposed for more constructive use, under proper leadership, naturally." He spread his hands in a gesture that encompassed the cottage, the village, the world beyond. "I'd like you to be part of that leadership, Elena. You've always been my finest student." The rain's rhythm changed, carrying a subtle message from Father Santiago's bell tower. Elena translated it automatically, major regime forces approaching from the north, at least 20 minutes out. Romano's appearance wasn't just about confronting her, it was about keeping her occupied until reinforcements arrived. Marco understood in the end, Romano added, the casual mention of her husband sending ice through Elena's veins. Before his unfortunate accident, he saw the logic of my position, the necessity of bringing order to chaos. His smile carried genuine affection, made all the more terrible by its sincerity. In fact, his last words were about you, about hoping you would understand the inevitable course of progress. Elena's mind raced through options, each seeming to lead to a dead end. Romano knew all her standard protocols, could anticipate her usual adaptations. But then she remembered something Marco had told her. The best plans aren't the ones that survive contact with the enemy unchanged. They're the ones that transform into something new under pressure. "What's your answer, dear Elena?" Romano asked, his hand still resting casually on the countermeasure device. "Will you join the new order we're building? Help us use the network's power for proper purpose? Or will you force me to take more decisive action?" His eyes flicked meaningfully to her belly, the threat clear but carefully understated. "Before we continue with Elena's confrontation in the cottage, we must understand the events of one crucial night 3 years ago, when the network's foundations first began to crack. If you're watching from a place where trust was tested by revolution, share your story in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for tomorrow's tale about a former intelligence officer who uncovered a conspiracy at the heart of government. The network's Milan headquarters had been hidden beneath an antiquarian bookshop for decades. That rainy October evening, Elena had arrived for what she thought was a routine briefing about new resistance operations. Instead, she found Professor Romano conducting a meeting that would shatter everything she thought she knew about the organization she served. "Control," Romano had told the gathered senior operatives, "is ultimately more important than freedom. The masses don't truly want freedom. They want structure, guidance, purpose." He stood among the rare books and encrypted communications equipment, looking every bit the distinguished professor, despite the radical shift in his rhetoric. The network's true potential lies not in destroying power structures, but in perfecting them. Elena, concealed in the shadow of a massive bookshelf, had watched in growing horror as her mentor outlined his vision. The network's sophisticated systems of influence and control, originally developed to fight oppression, would be repurposed to create what Romano called enlightened authority. Their intelligence-gathering methods would serve not to expose corruption, but to maintain it more efficiently. The old regime was crude, brutish in its application of power, Romano explained to his carefully selected audience. "We have spent years developing more sophisticated methods of control. Why waste them on abstract ideals when we could use them to build something lasting?" The worst part was how reasonable he made it sound, how elegantly he presented the manipulation of millions as a form of protection. Madame Rosetta, Elena's old combat instructor, had stood up in opposition. "The network exists to fight oppression, not perfect it," she had declared. But even as she spoke, Elena noticed how many of the gathered operatives nodded along with Romano's words. How many seemed to have already accepted his twisted logic. The professor's response had been chilling in its calm efficiency. "My dear Rosetta, who do you think has been funding our more sophisticated operations these past few years? Where did you think the money for our new training facilities came from?" His smile carried genuine affection, even as he signaled to guards. Elena had never seen before. "The transition has already begun. I'm merely making it official." Elena had watched, frozen in horror, as Madame Rosetta and the few others who objected were quietly removed. Their resistance training had proven useless against Romano's preparations. He had arranged everything perfectly, just as he had taught his students to do. The network's own techniques were being used to dismantle its original purpose. That night had revealed the true scope of Romano's betrayal. He hadn't merely switched sides. He had spent years gradually repositioning the network's resources, reorienting its operations, preparing it for transformation into something its founders had fought against. The sophisticated codes they had developed to fight oppression were being repurposed to enable it more effectively. Marco had been one of the first to recognize the signs. The new shipping regulations, he had told Elena when she brought him. Her discoveries, they're not just about control. They're about creating dependencies, making entire regions reliant on specific supply chains that can be manipulated. His understanding of economic patterns had helped him see the bigger picture forming behind Romano's seemingly disconnected initiatives. Together, they had begun gathering evidence of the professor's activities. The documents they accumulated revealed a pattern of systematic corruption, showing how Romano had been quietly building connections with powerful figures in both the old regime and the new government. He wasn't just changing sides, he was positioning himself to maintain control regardless of who held official power. The brilliance of it, Marco had said with grim admiration, is how he's using our own methods against us. Every technique we develop to fight the regime, he's adapting to serve it. The realization had led them to question everything, to review years of operations for signs of manipulation they had missed. Elena's pregnancy had complicated their investigation, but it had also provided cover for their activities. Who would suspect a couple preparing for their first child of orchestrating a complex counterintelligence operation? They had used every technique Romano had taught them to document his betrayal, building a case that could expose the entire conspiracy. But Romano had not spent decades training intelligence operatives without learning to recognize their methods. The accident that had allegedly claimed Marco's life had been precisely targeted, designed not just to eliminate a threat, but to send a message to others who might oppose the professor's plans. Now, standing in her cottage facing her former mentor, Elena understood the full implications of that night in Milan. Romano hadn't just betrayed the network, he had transformed it, turned its most powerful tools against the very people it was meant to protect. The sophisticated techniques she had used to defend her home were ones he had helped develop, which meant he would know exactly how to counter them. The rain falling on Porto Vedera carried echoes of that night in Milan, of all the choices and consequences that had led to this moment. Elena's hand moved protectively over her belly as she considered the terrible symmetry of the situation. Romano had taught her everything she knew about intelligence operations, about hiding in plain sight, about using truth as a weapon. Now she would have to find a way to use those same lessons to defeat the master who had taught them. Elena's mind raced through possibilities as she maintained her position in the cottage's main room. Romano's presence had invalidated many of her prepared defenses, but his very predictability in countering them opened new opportunities. The professor had taught her that true strategy wasn't about having an unbeatable plan. It was about being able to transform defeat into advantage. "You taught me something crucial, Professor," Elena said, allowing a slight tremor to enter her voice. The display of vulnerability was calculated. Romano would expect her to try manipulating his emotions, which meant her apparent attempt to do so could itself become a form of misdirection. "You taught me that the best deception isn't about hiding the truth, but about choosing which truth to reveal." Romano's smile widened with genuine pride. "And you learned that lesson better than any student I've ever had." He gestured to Matteo and his men, who had begun spreading out to cover the room's exits. "Your performance as the grieving widow was masterful, using real emotion to support a tactical facade. I couldn't have designed it better myself." Through the window's reflection, Elena caught Sophia's signal from the cellar. The girl had recognized that their original plan needed modification and was implementing the contingency protocols they had prepared for worst-case scenarios. Elena had trained her well in the principle that no plan survives contact with the enemy unchanged. The network's techniques are wasted on resistance, Romano continued, his voice carrying the same passionate intensity he had once used to lecture about linguistic patterns. Think about what we could achieve with proper resources, proper authority. Your child could grow up in a world of perfect order, protected by the very systems we've spent years perfecting. Elena shifted her weight slightly, using her pregnancy to disguise the movement's tactical purpose. The rain's rhythm had changed again. Father Santiago was signaling that regime forces were now 15 minutes out, but the change in pattern also carried a secondary message. Her external network was adapting, implementing the modified protocols she had prepared for exactly this type of situation. "You're right about one thing," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the tension coiling through her muscles. "I did learn your lessons well, including the one about how every strength can become a weakness if you depend on it too much." Her hand moved to her belly in what appeared to be a protective gesture, but actually triggered the next phase of her adapted defense. The cottage's carefully prepared systems began activating in new patterns, different from the standard protocols Romano would be expecting. Elena had spent months developing these contingencies, creating layers of defense that could be reconfigured on the fly. The professor had taught her to be methodical, but Marco had taught her to be creative. "Your compound dispersal systems are neutralized," Romano noted with academic interest, holding up his countermeasure device. "Your communication disruption equipment is blocked. Your optical deterrents are compensated for. Did you really think I wouldn't prepare for every technique I taught you?" "No, Professor," Elena answered, allowing a small smile to play across her lips. "I counted on it." The tremor in her voice disappeared, replaced by the quiet confidence that had made La Sombra legendary. "You taught me to be systematic, to plan for every contingency, but Marco taught me something else. He taught me to improvise." On cue, Sophia activated a system that Romano couldn't have predicted because Elena hadn't developed it until after his betrayal. The cottage's vintage radiators, which appeared to be original fixtures, began emitting a high-frequency pulse that interfered with his electronic countermeasures. It wasn't enough to disable them completely, but it created moments of unreliability. And in intelligence work, uncertainty was often more effective than outright confrontation. "Clever," Romano acknowledged as his device flickered, using old technology to counter new countermeasures, but ultimately futile. He reached into his pocket and produced a second device. "You see, I anticipated that you might have developed new methods. That's why I brought redundant systems." But Elena had anticipated his anticipation. The apparent technical interference was actually a distraction from more subtle changes taking place. The cottage's defenses were reconfiguring themselves according to patterns based not on network protocols, but on the shipping route algorithms she and Marco had developed together. "You taught me to think in terms of systems and protocols," Elena continued, each word precisely chosen to hold Romano's attention. "But there's something you never fully understood about how Marco and I adapted your methods. We didn't just apply them to shipping routes, we transformed them into something new." Through the copperpot's reflection, she saw Matteo frown, as he noticed something odd about the way shadows were moving across the floor. The cottage's carefully positioned windows were creating subtle light patterns that affected depth perception in ways that weren't immediately obvious. It wasn't enough to disorient someone completely, but it would make precise movements more difficult over time. The interesting thing about pregnancy, Elena added conversationally, noting how Romano's eyes kept returning to her belly, is how it changes your perspective on time. 9 months of constant adaptation, of learning to work with limitations, rather than fighting them. She shifted position again, each movement part of a larger pattern that was gradually repositioning everyone in the room according to her modified strategy. The rain continued its steady drumming, but now it served a different purpose in Elena's tactical framework. Instead of using it to mask movements as originally planned, she was using its rhythm to create subtle psychological pressure. Another technique she had developed after learning of Romano's betrayal. The transformation of Porto Vedera began subtly, like ripples spreading across a still pond. Old Giuseppe closed his bakery early, but not before sending his grandson on seemingly innocent deliveries to specific houses. Maria's flower cart moved. Through the streets, each bouquet's arrangement carrying coded messages to those who knew how to read them. Father Santiago's church bells continued their measured tolling, each pattern conveying precise instructions to different parts of the village. "You see, Professor," Elena said, noting how Romano's eyes narrowed as he began detecting patterns in the village's activity. "You taught me that true power lies in systems of control, but Marco taught me that the strongest systems aren't imposed from above. They grow organically from within." Through her window, Elena could see her network activating in ways that even Romano's careful preparation couldn't have anticipated. The fishermen returning early from the bay, their boats arranged in formations that signaled specific responses. The laundry being taken down from lines in patterns that conveyed tactical information. Children playing games in the street, whose movements created sophisticated surveillance patterns. The village, Romano realized, genuine admiration coloring his voice. "You've turned the entire village into an extension of your defense system." His eyes tracked the seemingly random movements outside with new understanding. Every daily activity encoded with tactical purpose, every routine interaction carrying hidden meaning. Elena allowed herself a small smile, one that carried echoes of the lessons she had learned at his feet. "You taught me to build networks of influence, to create systems of control. But you never understood that the strongest networks aren't based on control at all. They're based on trust." Matteo moved to the window, his trained eye trying to decode the patterns of village life unfolding before him. "Sir, the market square is emptying. The cafes are closing. It's too coordinated to be coincidence." His voice carried the first edges of genuine concern. "Of course it is," Romano replied, his tone carrying both pride and frustration. "She's transformed the entire community into a defensive network. Every shopkeeper, every fisherman, every child playing in the street, they're all part of her system." He turned to Elena with newfound respect. "You've taken everything I taught you about control and turned it into something entirely different." Through carefully positioned mirrors, Elena caught glimpses of her network in action. Old Maria's flower cart had stopped at strategic corners, each position creating lines of sight that could be used for coordination. The children's games had evolved into patterns that effectively monitored every approach to the cottage. Even the village cats seemed to be moving with purpose, their positions marking blind spots in potential surveillance. "You focused on building systems to control people," Elena explained, each word carefully chosen to keep Romano's attention while her network continued its quiet mobilization. "I focused on building systems to protect them. The difference is, people will fight to maintain something that protects them." Sophia's signal from the cellar confirmed that the village's secondary defense networks were now fully activated. The seemingly decorative boats in the harbor had begun shifting positions, creating barriers that would funnel any approaching vessels into predictable channels. The narrow streets that had appeared randomly arranged were revealing their tactical purpose, creating choke points and fallback positions. Fascinating, Romano mused, watching the village transform before his eyes. You've created a living organism of defense, where every member of the community plays their part without even realizing the full scope of the system. The market women, gossiping on corners, are actually maintaining surveillance. The old men playing cards are coordinating responses. The children's games are creating security patterns. Elena felt her baby kick, as if responding to the tension in the air. That's the difference between us, Professor. You see people as pieces to be controlled. I see them as allies to be trusted. Her hand moved to her belly in what appeared to be a comforting gesture, but actually signaled the next phase of community response. Father Santiago's bells changed pattern again, and the village responded with subtle but significant shifts. Fishermen began securing their boats in ways that would make them difficult for outsiders to use. Shop owners closed shutters in patterns that created defensible positions throughout the narrow streets. Even the stray dogs that usually roam the harbour seemed to understand their role, taking up positions that would alert the community to any strange movements. Your regime reinforcements are 15 minutes out, Elena noted calmly. But they'll find something very different from what they're expecting. This isn't just my cottage they're approaching. It's an entire community that's learned to protect itself. Through the window, she could see Giuseppe positioning his bread delivery cart, its innocent appearance concealing its role as a communications hub. Maria's flower arrangements had evolved into a sophisticated signal system, each bloom's position conveying specific information to those who knew the code. The children's games had seamlessly transitioned into surveillance patterns that covered every approach to the village center. The real power of a network, Elena continued, watching understanding dawn in her former mentor's eyes, isn't in how well it controls information flow. It's in how naturally it adapts to protect what matters. She could see Romano calculating, reassessing, realizing that his carefully prepared assault force would be facing not just one trained operative, but an entire village that moved with coordinated purpose. The rain continued its steady drumming on Porto Vedera, but now it seemed to carry a different rhythm. Not the sound of isolation that Romano had counted on, but the pulse of a community, united in defense of one of its own. Romano's laughter cut through the cottage like broken glass. "Oh, Elena," he said, genuine affection mixing with cold calculation in his voice. "Did you think I wouldn't have my own network in place, that I wouldn't have spent months preparing for this moment?" He pulled a small silver phone from his pocket, one that Elena instantly recognized as military-grade secure communications equipment. "Let me show you what real preparation looks like." Before Elena could react, Romano pressed a single button. The effect was immediate and devastating. Explosions erupted simultaneously across Porto Vedera, not large enough to cause major structural damage, but perfectly placed to disrupt her carefully orchestrated defense network. The bakery's delivery route was cut off by a collapsed wall. Maria's flower cart was isolated by strategic debris, and key communication lines between different sectors of the village were suddenly broken. "You see," Romano continued as chaos erupted outside, "I learned from you too. I watched how you built your community defense system, how you wove it into the daily life of the village. Then I planted my own operators, my own patterns, my own subtle disruptions waiting to be triggered." Eleanor's mind raced as she assessed the damage. The explosions had been precisely targeted to fragment her network without causing casualties. Romano was still the master strategist who had taught her to value precision over brute force. Through the window, she could see her carefully coordinated village defense falling into disarray as key nodes of communication and coordination were cut off. "Your husband wasn't the only one who understood shipping patterns," Romano added, watching her reaction carefully. Those routine deliveries to Porto Vedera over the past 6 months. Each one carried small packages of carefully prepared explosives, positioned by operators who looked exactly like normal workers. We used your own techniques of hiding in plain sight against you. Sophia's signal from the cellar became erratic as the girl tried to adapt to the disruption of their established patterns. The village's coordinated defense was fragmenting into isolated pockets of resistance, exactly as Romano had planned. Even Father Santiago's bell tower had fallen silent, its sophisticated signaling system disrupted by strategically placed charges. The interesting thing about community defense networks, Romano lectured as if they were still in his classroom, is that they're actually more vulnerable than centralized systems. Cut the right connections, disrupt the right patterns, and the whole beautiful organism falls into chaos. His eyes gleamed with intellectual appreciation of his own strategy. You taught me that, my dear, with your brilliant work in destabilizing regime communication networks. But Elena had learned more than just network techniques during her years of resistance. Marco's influence had taught her to see patterns in chaos itself, to find opportunity in disruption. Even as her primary defense network crumbled, new possibilities were emerging from its ruins. You're right, Professor, she acknowledged, allowing genuine respect to color her tone. You've disrupted my network beautifully, but you've forgotten something crucial about complex systems. She shifted position, slightly, using the chaos outside to disguise her movement's true purpose. When you shatter a pattern, you don't destroy it. You create multiple new patterns. Through the cottage's windows, Elena could see her community beginning to adapt. The very chaos Romano had created was providing cover for new forms of coordination to emerge. Displaced villagers were naturally gathering in predictable locations, creating impromptu communication hubs. The debris from explosions was being instinctively moved in ways that created defensive positions. Fascinating, Romano mused, watching the village's organic response to his disruption. They're adapting without central coordination, falling back on the basic patterns you trained into them. His appreciation was genuine. He had always been a teacher at heart, able to recognize innovation even in opposition. Matteo moved nervously, clearly unsettled by the level of strategic complexity unfolding around him. Sir, we should act now, while their network is disrupted. The regime forces will be here soon. His hand tightened on his weapon, the soldier, in him wanting to take advantage of the tactical opportunity. But Romano held up a restraining hand, his eyes never leaving Elena. Watch and learn, he instructed. This is what happens when two master strategists clash. Every move creates counterpoints. Every disruption opens new possibilities. The question is, my dear former student, what patterns are you creating from the chaos I've given you? Elena felt her baby kick again, a reminder of everything at stake. The explosions had indeed shattered her carefully constructed network, but they had also created something Romano couldn't have predicted: a situation where the village's true character could emerge without the constraints of planned coordination. Through the copper pot's reflection, she caught glimpses of her community's natural resilience. Old Giuseppe had already transformed his disrupted delivery route into an impromptu medical station. Maria's isolated flower cart had become a rally point for displaced villagers. The children whose games had been surveillance patterns were now acting as message runners between separated groups. Before we continue with the chaos unfolding in Porto Vedera, we must return to one last crucial night. The evening when Elena discovered the true depth of Romano's betrayal and the real reason for Marco's accident. If you're watching from a place where personal and political betrayals have intersected, share your story in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for tomorrow's tale about a former diplomat who uncovered a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. It had been raining that night too, 6 months ago, when Elena found the hidden files in Marco's backup servers. She was 4 months pregnant, working late in their secure communication room, when an encryption pattern caught her eye, something subtly wrong in the shipping company's digital archives. Marco had always told her that the most important information hides in plain sight. Look for the patterns that seem too perfect, he would say. Real data has irregularities. When something looks flawless, that's often where the deception lies. Following his principle, she had begun digging deeper into the apparently ordinary shipping records. What she found shattered everything she thought she knew about the network's operations. The files revealed that Romano hadn't simply betrayed the resistance. He had been playing both sides for decades, using the network's intelligence-gathering capabilities to build his own power base. The professor had been collecting compromising information on both regime officials and resistance leaders, positioning himself to control whoever emerged victorious. The perfect operation, Marco had written in his encrypted notes, isn't about choosing sides. It's about controlling all sides. The words had chilled Elena when she first read them, but their full meaning only became clear as she decoded more of the files. Marco had discovered Romano's true plan: to use the network's sophisticated systems of influence to create a shadow government that would operate regardless of who held official power. But the most devastating revelation came in a hidden video file recorded the night before Marco's accident. In it, he faced the camera with grave determination, knowing he might not survive to deliver the message himself. "Elena, my love," he began, his voice steady despite the weight of what he had to share. "If you're watching this, then Romano has made his move. The professor isn't just corrupting the network, he's transforming it into something far more dangerous. He's creating what he calls the perfect system, a method of social control so subtle that people won't even realize they're being manipulated." The video had revealed how Romano had spent years developing new applications of network techniques. The professor had taken their methods of encrypted communication and subtle influence and expanded them to an unprecedented scale. He wasn't just planning to control information flow, he was creating a system to shape reality itself. The shipping routes were just the beginning, Marco explained in the recording. Romano is building a network of dependencies, economic, social, political, that will give him control over entire regions. The resistance thought we were fighting the regime, but we were actually helping Romano construct his own power structure. Elena had watched, her hand resting on her barely showing pregnancy, as Marco detailed the professor's true masterstroke. Romano hadn't just betrayed the resistance, he had used their fight against the regime to test and perfect his methods of control. Every successful operation against government forces had provided data for improving his system. "But here's what Romano doesn't understand," Marco continued, his eyes intense with purpose. "Control based on fear and manipulation will always be vulnerable to one thing: genuine human connection. That's why I've been helping you build something different in Porto Vedera, something based on trust rather than control." The truth about Marco's death became clear as Elena decoded more files. He hadn't been eliminated just because he discovered Romano's plan. He had been eliminated because he and Elena were creating an alternative model that threatened the very foundation of the professor's system. Their community-based network in Porto Vedera demonstrated that people could work together effectively without central control. "The baby," Marco said in the video's final moments, his hand reaching toward the camera as if trying to touch her, "across time, represents everything Romano fears: a future he can't control, connections he can't manipulate, love he can't corrupt. Protect our child, Elena, but also protect what we've built in Porto Vedera. It's more than just a defense network. It's proof that there's a better way. The video ended with Marco sharing one last crucial piece of information: the location of evidence that could expose Romano's entire operation. He had hidden it in a place so obvious that the professor's sophisticated intelligence network would overlook it, using the same principle that Elena now employed in her cottage's defenses. Now, standing in her living room, facing her former mentor, Elena understood the full significance of Marco's last message. Romano's explosions hadn't just disrupted her defense network, they had demonstrated exactly why his system of control was ultimately flawed. Real human connections couldn't be permanently severed by breaking communication patterns. True community couldn't be destroyed by disrupting coordination protocols. The rain falling on Porto Vedera carried echoes of that night 6 months ago, when Elena had first understood the true nature of her fight. She wasn't just protecting herself or her unborn child. She was protecting the possibility of a world where connection triumphed over control, where trust proved stronger than fear. The cottage seemed to hold its breath as Elena faced her former mentor. Outside, Porto Vedera was transforming in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. Romano's explosions had shattered her planned defense network, but the chaos was birthing something new, something that emerged from the community itself, rather than from any strategic design. "You still don't see it, do you, Professor?" Elena's voice carried the quiet confidence that had made La Sombra legendary. "You've spent so long thinking about systems of control that you've forgotten what real human connection looks like." She moved with deliberate grace, each step precise. Despite her pregnancy, the village isn't adapting because of my protocols. It's adapting because of what Marco and I helped them become. Romano's eyes narrowed as he observed the scene unfolding through the cottage windows. The villagers were organizing themselves in patterns he hadn't predicted, creating new communication networks from the very chaos he had engineered. "Fascinating," he mused. Genuine intellectual curiosity warring with strategic concern. They're implementing basic network principles without direct coordination. "Not network principles," Elena corrected, watching Sophia's signal from the cellar shift to their deepest contingency protocols. "Human principles. The ones you taught me to exploit but never truly understood." Her hand moved to her belly as the baby kicked, the gesture carrying layers of meaning. Marco saw it before anyone. The strongest networks aren't built on control, they're built on trust. Matteo shifted nervously, his tactical training telling him something was changing, in ways he couldn't quite grasp. "Sir, the regime forces are 10 minutes out, but the village response isn't following standard patterns. We're losing predictability." Through the copper pot's reflection, Elena saw Giuseppe's grandson delivering bread with new urgency, each delivery point becoming an impromptu coordination center. Maria's scattered flowers had become markers for the community's emerging response patterns. Even the children's disrupted games had evolved into something more organic, genuine play that served strategic purpose without losing its essential nature. "You've created something remarkable," Romano acknowledged, his tone carrying pride and regret in equal measure. "A self-organizing defense system that becomes stronger when disrupted. But you've forgotten something crucial about chaos theory." His hand moved to his pocket, where Elena knew he carried another layer of prepared countermeasures. The more complex a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to cascade failure. The professor produced another device, smaller than the first, but more sophisticated. "This will disable every electronic system in a half-mile radius. Communications, power, everything." His eyes met Elena's with genuine sympathy. "Your community's admirable adaptation won't matter if they can't coordinate at all." But Elena smiled, the expression carrying echoes of lessons learned at his feet. That's the final lesson Marco taught me, Professor, one you never understood. True coordination doesn't depend on systems or protocols. She shifted positions slightly, using her pregnancy to disguise the movement's tactical purpose. It depends on trust. As if on cue, Father Santiago's church bells began ringing again, not with their usual sophisticated patterns, but with a simple, ancient rhythm that every villager would recognize. The sound carried across Porto Vedera, drawing responses that had nothing to do with resistance training or network protocols. You see, Elena continued, watching understanding dawn in her mentor's eyes. While you were studying our defense network, planning how to disrupt it, we were building something much simpler and more powerful. Something that doesn't need electronics or complicated protocols to function. Romano's device hummed to life, sending out its disruptive pulse. Electronic systems across the village flickered and died. But instead of creating the cascade of confusion he expected, the community's response actually accelerated. Villagers who had been coordinating through sophisticated signals simply shifted to older methods. Patterns of movement learned from generations of fishermen, market women's calls that carried meaning beyond words, children's games that had transmitted information long before technology existed. Impossible, Matteo breathed, watching the village's organic response through the window. They're moving like a trained unit, but without any central coordination. Not impossible, Elena corrected. Inevitable. Because what you're seeing isn't a defense network anymore. It's a community protecting one of its own. Her voice carried absolute certainty as she added, and that's something no amount of tactical disruption can defeat. The rain's rhythm changed, carrying messages, in patterns older than the network itself. Elena saw Romano recognize the sophistication of what she and Marco had actually built. Not just a tactical defense system, but a living community that could function without electronic coordination, without sophisticated protocols, without centralized control. Through carefully positioned mirrors, Elena caught glimpses of her true network emerging. Old Giuseppe wasn't just a baker maintaining surveillance. He was a grandfather, protecting his family's future. Maria's flower signals weren't just tactical communications. They were a neighbor watching out for her community. The children's games weren't surveillance patterns. They were the natural expression of a community where everyone looked out for everyone else. You taught me to build systems of control, Elena told her former mentor, each word carrying the weight of everything she had learned beyond his teachings. But Marco taught me to build connections of trust. And that's why you've already lost, Professor, because you can't control what people freely choose to become. The transformation of Porto Vedera from a tactical battlefield into something far more powerful happened in waves, like the tide coming in to reshape the shore. Romano watched through the cottage windows as his carefully orchestrated disruption yielded results entirely different from what he had planned. Instead of creating confusion and isolation, his actions had stripped away the sophisticated layers of Elena's defense network to reveal something far more fundamental beneath. Remarkable, he murmured, genuine academic appreciation warring with tactical concern. They're not just adapting, they're transcending the need for formal coordination entirely. His eyes tracked the movement of villagers through the rain-slicked streets, noting how they naturally filled roles that his explosions had tried to disrupt. Elena felt her baby kick again as she watched her former mentor realize the full implications of what he was seeing. You know what your real mistake was, Professor. She kept her voice gentle, almost sympathetic. You thought Marco and I were building a more sophisticated version of the network, but we were actually building something much simpler and much more powerful. Through the copper pot's reflection, she saw Matteo's growing unease as regime. Reinforcements approached a village that was responding in ways his tactical training couldn't predict. The military unit would find not a disorganized collection of civilians, but a community moving with organic purpose that no amount of strategic planning could counter. "Sir," Matteo reported tensely, "the village defense isn't breaking down. It's evolving. Every disruption we create is being absorbed and repurposed." His hand tightened on his weapon as he added, "And our reinforcements are reporting unusual resistance patterns on their approach routes." Elena allowed herself a small smile as she heard the confusion in Matteo's voice. The regime forces were encountering not the organized resistance they'd trained to fight, but something far more challenging, the natural protective responses of a community that had learned to work together without needing commands or protocols. "Your reinforcements are 8 minutes out," she told Romano calmly, "but they're finding that every route into Porto Vedera has become mysteriously difficult to navigate, not because of tactical obstacles, but because of dozens of small, natural, community activities that just happen to make military movement extremely challenging." As if to illustrate her point, a group of fishermen began moving their boats in the harbor, not in the coordinated patterns of her defense network, but in the organic rhythms of men who had worked together for generations. Their movements just happened to make it impossible for any unknown vessel to approach the village unobserved. "The market women aren't maintaining surveillance positions anymore," Elena continued, watching understanding dawn in Romano's eyes. "They're just sharing news the way they always have, but somehow that news is reaching exactly who needs to hear it. The children aren't playing coordinated games, they're just being children, but their natural play is creating better coverage than any planned pattern could achieve." Romano's tactical genius allowed him to see the full implications of what was happening. His explosions had disrupted Elena's sophisticated defense network, but in doing so, they had revealed something far more formidable. A community that could protect itself instinctively without needing any artificial system of control. "Sophia," Elena called softly, knowing the girl would hear her through the cottage's carefully designed acoustics. "Implement Protocol Omega." It wasn't a tactical command anymore, but permission for the girl to share what she had truly learned during their time together. Sophia's response came not through their planned signal system, but through the natural actions of a young person who had learned to be part of something larger than herself. The girl began moving through the cellar's hidden passages, not according to rehearsed protocols, but with the confident purpose of someone activating connections she truly understood. "You see, Professor," Elena explained as she watched her, "plans transcend their original design. While you were studying our tactical preparations, tracking our supply movements, and planning countermeasures for our defense protocols, you missed what we were actually building. You were so focused on the sophisticated overlay that you never saw the simple, unshakable foundation beneath it." Through the window, she could see Giuseppe's grandson Tommy running messages between houses, not in the careful patterns they had practiced, but with the natural urgency of a child helping his community. Maria's flower cart had become a gathering point not because of tactical design, but because it was where people naturally stopped to share news and support each other. "I taught you too well," Romano acknowledged, genuine pride mixing with resignation in his voice. "You didn't just learn to build systems of control, you learned to transcend the need for them entirely." His hand moved away from his pocket, away from the weapons and devices he had brought to counter Elena's expected tactics. "You've created something I don't know how to fight." The rain continued falling on Porto Vedera, but now it seemed to carry a different message, not the rhythm of tactical signals, but the natural pulse of a community moving to protect its own. Elena felt her baby kick again, as if recognizing this moment when artificial systems fell away to reveal the genuine connections beneath. "That's the final lesson, Professor," Elena said softly. watching her former mentor realize that his sophisticated plans had been defeated not by better tactics, but by something far more fundamental. The strongest networks aren't built by controlling people. They're built by trusting them to become what they're truly meant to be. As regime reinforcements found themselves increasingly entangled in Porto Vedera's organic defense, Elena knew it was time for the final revelation. She caught Sophia's eye through the cottage's carefully positioned mirrors and gave a slight nod. The girl didn't need sophisticated signals anymore. She understood exactly what that simple gesture meant. "You should know, Professor," Elena said, watching Sophia disappear into the deeper recesses of the cellar, "that Marco left more than just evidence about your operations. He left instructions about when and how certain truths should be revealed." Her hand moved to her belly as she added, "including one truth that even you haven't figured out yet." Romano's eyes narrowed slightly, his tactical mind trying to anticipate what final move his former student might have prepared. "Marco is dead, Elena. I made sure of that myself." But there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. A teacher, recognizing that his best student might have learned lessons beyond his teaching. Through the cottage windows, Elena could see her community continuing to evolve beyond the tactical patterns she had designed. Giuseppe wasn't just manning his bakery-turned-communications hub anymore. He was organizing food distribution to families disrupted by Romano's explosions. Maria's flower signals had transformed into genuine bouquets of comfort for those whose homes had been damaged. "You're right about one thing," Elena acknowledged, watching understanding begin to dawn in her former mentor's eyes. "Marco Rossi is dead. But Marco wasn't just a name. It was a role, a position in a much larger pattern." She allowed herself a small smile as she added, "Something you taught me, actually, about how the best cover identities aren't created, they're inherited." Sophia returned from the cellar, carrying not tactical equipment or weapons, but a simple, leather-bound journal. "The final protocol," she announced, her young voice carrying the weight of understood responsibility rather than rehearsed duty. She handed the journal not to Elena, but to Romano himself. "Open it," Elena instructed softly. "See what your perfect system of control never managed to detect?" Her voice carried no triumph, only a gentle sadness for what her mentor had become. "See what grows in the spaces between your carefully monitored patterns." Romano opened the journal with hands that showed the slightest tremor, not from fear, but from the intellectual's deep need to know. Inside, he found not encoded resistance communications or tactical plans, but something far more devastating to his worldview. The personal diary of Marcus Romano, his own father. "Your father wasn't just a university professor," Elena explained. As Romano began to read, he was the original architect of the network, not as a system of control, but as a way to protect people from exactly the kind of manipulation you're trying to create. She watched emotions play across her former mentor's face as he encountered his father's words. "Marco didn't die in that university bombing 30 years ago. He went underground, took a new identity, kept building connections based on trust, rather than control." The journal revealed the full scope of the generational struggle that Romano had never recognized. His father had faked his death specifically to prevent his brilliant but misguided son from corrupting the network's true purpose. Over decades, Marcus Romano had moved through multiple identities, each time building connections that could resist his son's growing systems of control. "Your father was the original Marco," Elena continued gently, "and when he grew too old to maintain the role himself, he passed it to others who understood his vision. Each Marco added their own contributions to his work, building layers of trust that your surveillance could never penetrate." Her hand rested on her belly as she added, just as this child will carry forward something more powerful than any system of control, the capacity for genuine human connection. Through the window, Porto Vedera continued demonstrating exactly what Marcus Romano had envisioned. The community wasn't just resisting regime forces, it was absorbing them, transforming their tactical approach into something more human. Soldiers expecting to encounter resistance fighters found themselves instead facing grandmothers offering shelter from the rain, children sharing bread from Giuseppe's bakery, fishermen helping their vehicles avoid dangerous puddles. The network was never supposed to be about sophisticated tradecraft or elegant deception, Elena explained, watching her former mentor confront his father's true legacy. Those were tools, nothing more. The real purpose was to help people remember how to trust each other, how to build connections that no amount of control could corrupt. Matteo and his men watched in confusion as their carefully planned operation continued dissolving, not through tactical opposition, but through genuine human interaction. Their military training had no protocols for dealing with authentic community response, no countermeasures for real human connection. "This is what your father understood," Elena continued, her voice gentle with compassion for the brilliant man who had lost his way. "True power isn't in controlling people, it's in helping them become strong enough that they don't need to be controlled." She gestured to the village beyond the cottage windows. "Look at what's happening out there. That's not resistance or defiance. That's human nature, expressing itself in its most powerful form. People choosing to protect each other simply because they can." Romano closed the journal slowly, his tactical genius allowing him to see the full implications of what he had discovered. His sophisticated systems of control, his carefully planned network of influence, his elegant methods of manipulation, all of them were being defeated not by better tactics, but by the simple power of genuine human connection. The transformation of Porto Vedera continued, but now it carried new meaning as the truth of Marcus Romano's legacy spread through the community. The village wasn't just defending itself anymore, it was demonstrating the power of the very principles the original network had been created to protect. Each act of cooperation, each moment of genuine connection, served as living proof that trust was stronger than control. "Your father's last entry," Elena said softly, watching Romano process everything he had learned, was written the day before he passed the role of Marco to the man I would eventually marry. He wrote about you, about his hope that someday you would understand what he was trying to build. She moved carefully through the cottage, her pregnancy now a symbol not just of future life, but of continuing legacy. Through the copper pot's reflection, she could see the regime forces encountering something they had never trained for. Their tactical approach to the village was being transformed by dozens of small, genuine interactions. Soldiers raising their weapons found themselves accepting cups of coffee from old women who reminded them of their grandmothers. Strategic positions became impromptu community gathering points where children shared stories and fishermen offered weather advice. "The network was never meant to be a weapon," Elena continued, watching understanding continue to reshape her former mentor's worldview. "It was meant to be a reminder, a way of showing people that they already knew how to connect, how to trust, how to protect each other without needing systems of control." Sophia moved through the cottage with new purpose, no longer playing the role of trained operative, but simply being what she truly was, a young person who had learned to be part of something larger than herself. She began gathering the elements of Elena's tactical preparations, not to hide them, but to transform them into symbols of the community's evolution. "Sir," Matteo reported, confusion clear in his voice, "the regime forces are integrating. Not just tactically, but..." He struggled to find words for what he was seeing. They're becoming part of the village's pattern, but not in any way we can counter. The soldier in him was recognizing that his training had no protocols for dealing with a genuine human connection. Romano sat heavily in one of Elena's carefully positioned chairs, his father's journal open in his hands. "All these years," he murmured, "I thought I was perfecting his work, taking the network's principles to their logical conclusion." His tactical genius was allowing him to see how completely he had misunderstood his father's true legacy. But I was actually working against everything he built. Through the window, Elena could see Giuseppe organizing a community meal, using his bakery's resources not for tactical advantage, but for genuine sustenance. Maria's flowers were being distributed not as signals, but as gifts, bringing color and life to areas damaged by Romano's explosions. The children's games had evolved beyond surveillance patterns into real play that somehow still managed to keep the community safer than any planned system. "Look at them," Elena suggested gently, gesturing to the village beyond the cottage. "Not as a tactical operator, not as a strategist, but as your father's son. See what he was trying to preserve." Her voice carried the weight of everything she had learned beyond Romano's teaching. They're not following protocols or responding to control. They're simply being human in the best possible way. The rain continued falling on Porto Vedera, but now it seemed to wash away layers of artifice and deception, revealing the authentic connections that had always existed beneath the surface. The sophisticated defense network Elena had built was transforming into something more natural and more powerful. A community that protected itself simply because that was its true nature. "The child," Romano said suddenly, his eyes moving to Elena's pregnant belly with new understanding. "It's not just about continuing the resistance or preserving the network, is it?" His brilliant mind was finally grasping the full scope of what she and Marco had been building. It's about proving that genuine human connection can never be fully controlled or corrupted. Elena nodded, letting her hand rest where her baby kicked. "This child will grow up knowing both sides of the legacy, your father's vision of trust and connection, and your lesson about how those things must sometimes be protected from those who would corrupt them." She met her former mentor's eyes with genuine compassion. "The question is, which part of that legacy will you choose to honor now?" Sophia returned from another room, carrying not tactical equipment, but photographs, images of the village's daily life that revealed how Elena's defense network had grown naturally from existing community connections. Each picture showed moments of genuine interaction that had been woven into sophisticated tactical patterns, proving that the strongest systems grew from authentic human bonds. "Your father believed," Elena continued, watching the last of Romano's tactical resistance crumble, "that humans naturally organize themselves in ways that protect what matters most. All the network needed to do was remind them of that capacity, help them trust their own instincts for connection and mutual protection." Through carefully positioned mirrors, Elena caught glimpses of her community continuing to evolve. The village was becoming something that would outlast any tactical victory, a living example of what Marcus Romano had tried to create, what his son had almost destroyed, and what Elena had helped rebuild in a form that could never be fully suppressed. The transformation wasn't just in the village's organized response to threat, but in how that response grew naturally from genuine human connection. Every tactical pattern Elena had designed was being replaced by something more organic and more powerful, the authentic expression of a community that had remembered how to trust itself. 6 months after the transformation of Porto Vedera, Elena stood in her cottage garden, her newborn daughter cradled in her arms. The village had changed in ways that went far beyond tactical evolution or strategic adaptation. What had begun as a sophisticated defense network had grown into something that would have made Marcus Romano proud, a community that protected itself through genuine connection rather than controlled response. "She has her grandfather's eyes," Romano observed quietly from where he sat on the garden bench. The professor's role had shifted dramatically since that rainy day of confrontation. Instead of trying to control the network, he had dedicated himself to understanding his father's true vision. His brilliant tactical mind, once focused on manipulation, now worked to protect and nurture authentic human connection. Through the cottage windows, Elena could see Sophia teaching a new group of young people. But she wasn't instructing them in surveillance techniques or coded communications. Instead, she was showing them how to recognize and strengthen the natural patterns of community support that had always existed beneath the surface of daily life. "Your father would be proud," Elena told Romano, watching how his face softened at the mention of Marcus, "not just of her, but of what you're helping to build now." She adjusted her daughter's blanket, remembering how the child had been born into a community that had transcended its tactical origins to become something far more powerful. Giuseppe's bakery had evolved beyond its role as a communications hub. While it still served as a natural gathering point for sharing information, its primary purpose had returned to what it was always meant to be, a place where bread and conversation brought people together in genuine ways. The tactical advantage this created was real, but secondary to its true function in the community. Maria's flower cart still moved through the village daily, but her bouquets no longer carried coded messages. Instead, they served their original purpose of bringing beauty and connection to daily life. The fact that this created natural surveillance patterns was less important than how it strengthened authentic community bonds. "The interesting thing," Romano mused, his academic mind still analyzing patterns but with new understanding, "is how the most effective security measures turn out to be the ones that grow naturally from human connection." He gestured to where children played in the street, their games no longer designed for tactical purpose, but somehow still maintaining perfect awareness of village activities. Elena smiled, remembering Marco's words about how the strongest systems are the ones people don't realize are systems at all. The village's defense network had become something more subtle and more powerful, an organic expression of community protection that grew from genuine relationships rather than imposed protocols. "Your father's journal," she said, watching Romano's hand move instinctively to where he kept the precious document, wasn't just a record of the network's true purpose. It was a testament to something more fundamental, the human capacity for connection that no system of control can fully suppress. Through carefully positioned mirrors, Elena caught glimpses of how Porto Vedera had continued to evolve. The fishermen still coordinated their movements in the harbour, but now it was through genuine cooperation rather than tactical design. The market women still shared information effectively, but through authentic conversation rather than coded signals. Even Father Santiago's church bells rang with their original purpose of marking community rhythms, their tactical significance secondary to their role in village life. La Sombra, Romano reflected, using her old codename with new understanding, was never really about being a shadow, was it? It was about illuminating what already existed, the connections and trust that people naturally create when given the chance. Elena's daughter stirred in her arms, reaching out toward the sunlight that played through the garden's leaves. "That's why the network's original purpose was so powerful," she agreed. "It didn't try to create artificial systems of control. It just helped people remember their natural capacity for mutual protection and support." The village's transformation had rippled outward, influencing other communities in ways that no tactical operation could have achieved. people visited Porto Vedera and found not a sophisticated defense system, but an authentic community that protected itself through genuine connection. They carried those lessons back to their own villages, creating a network of trust that grew organically rather than through strategic design. "You know what the most remarkable thing is?" Romano said, watching the village life unfold around them. "All those years I spent developing systems of control, and the most effective security measures turn out to be the ones that don't need to be controlled at all." His tactical genius had finally understood what his father had always known. That true strength grows from trust rather than manipulation. Sophia emerged from the cottage carrying not tactical reports, but community stories, records of how genuine human connections had created protection more powerful than any planned defense. The girl who had once trained to be an operative had become something more valuable, a keeper of the village's authentic heritage of mutual support and protection. "Your father wrote something else in his final entry," Elena told Romano, watching her daughter reach for the play of light and shadow in the garden. "He said that the greatest victory isn't in perfecting systems of control, but in helping people remember that they already know how to protect what matters most." The sun continued its path over Porto Vedera, illuminating a community that had transcended its tactical origins to become something that Marcus Romano had envisioned decades ago, a living proof that genuine human connection was the strongest defense against those who would impose control. Elena's daughter, born into this transformed village, would grow up understanding both the shadow and the light, carrying forward a legacy that proved trust was ultimately more powerful than fear. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.